This podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box to this episode. Patreon is a monthly subscription and you can cancel anytime. And PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. I'm Rania Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.
Hussein Ibish, Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. I also write a weekly column for Bloomberg and a weekly column for The National. If you remember the Arab Spring protests in certain countries, not the ones we're seeing now, but in other countries, in Tunisia, in Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, etc., in 2010 and 2011, if you look back on it, you would say, well, did anything fundamentally change? Well, in Tunisia, yes, and elsewhere, if they did change, for example, in Syria, it changed for the worse in the sense that there's been a great deal of damage without anything accomplished. And yes, Egypt appears to be, if anything, more autocratic and repressive than it was before, etc. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't historic. That doesn't mean that they won't have long-term implications of various kinds. And so in this case, I think it's really interesting because if we, you can't really throw them all into the same basket, even though there's a lot of interesting similarities between the Iraqi and the Lebanese situations. They are fundamentally different. In the case of Lebanon, I think it's clear that the economic and political structures in the country have not changed. They are fundamentally unchanged. The nature of the government has changed now, but the basic equation on the side of power has not fundamentally altered. The way they do, who they are, the way they do business, the way they see the world has not changed. I would argue that on the side of demonstrators, and because of their efforts in terms of the public conversation in Lebanon and the national culture, something really fundamental has changed. And my view is that in the Lebanese context, this is not in Iraq, there's something else going on. But in the Lebanese context, what the protests have revived is an old idea of Lebanon as a modern nation-state project, as a national project that strives towards the creation of a unified identity, will work towards eventually. So, if you go back to the origins of the state, right, yes, in the late 30s and the 40s, you're talking about a set of leaders who understood that there were community and confessional and sectarian distinctions among the Lebanese. And that, when you talked about a potential Republic of Lebanon, you were talking about an aspirational thing that not only didn't exist in theory, it didn't exist even kind of aspirationally. But what they thought was that if you created a Lebanese state that constructed an equilibrium of these different constituencies that was functional, eventually the state could develop to create a national identity through a modern national project that transcended those differences and created a Lebanon e pluribus unum, one out of many, right, or out of many one. And yes, that idea, I think, was very present in Lebanese discourse and culture and whatnot in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And it died a death, we thought, during the Civil War, beginning in 1975, going through to 1990, and then in this highly contested, highly sectarian and confessional and communitarian system that has existed since Taif, throughout the 90s and until now. If you had said to people 8 months ago, 9 months ago, and any time before that, going back into the 70s, that the ideal of Lebanon as a modern national project that would transcend communal differences and create a modern national identity was still there, I think people would have been entitled to kind of snicker and dismiss it and whatnot. And you can't do that anymore, because I think what the protests did is demonstrate that dormant ideal is not in fact dead, that dormant ideal exists. And insofar as the ideal exists, the potential for it to eventually emerge also exists. And I would point to something really important. In the Constitution, there are more than one provisions, all unenacted, that point to a non-communal, non-sectarian, genuinely democratic parliament. A lower house that is simply based on one person, one vote, and then an upper house that continues to express the national pact. There has never been an instance in recent decades, in the post-Taif period, where you could imagine how on earth pressures to implement those provisions in the Constitution, to create a bicameral legislature in which the lower house would be non-sectarian, non-communitarian, and democratic, and more responsive to the public, could possibly emerge. But now I think you can. You can imagine that becomes a rallying cry for protests that continue, even in a less dramatic way, but continue into the future. And that you can imagine it being picked up by some politicians in the country. And you can imagine it becoming part of a set of reform demands by international donors who want to help to do a short-term and long-term economic rescue. And I don't think it's unthinkable anymore. It's a long shot. It's difficult to imagine. It's not really on the front of anyone's agenda, et cetera. But it's there in the Constitution. The sentiment to demand it is there, and the leverage is there in terms of the political and economic crises that continue to roil the country.
I really like the long view, and you eloquently just described both the structural problems Lebanon has been trying to overcome going back to the 30s and 40s, the previous attempts at reform that did not really muster much in the end. They kind of either inevitably those efforts dwindled, or they failed, or sometimes they led to outright violence. And that this time around, there's a lining up of circumstances which are in fact unusual. And I think this kind of maybe goes directly to an article you released in Bloomberg Banyan. I like the title because that title, I think, is an existential title for Lebanon. And if you'll permit me, it's Desperation Might Just Drive Lebanon to Reform. And I think that says it all, because the desperation this time is not just a sort of group of secular-minded protesters demanding change. This is dramatic pain felt for maybe the first time in a generation, where you have people, country. Absolutely, and it's a genuine suffering that has made people rethink the country they live in.
Yes,
I get from what you're saying and from other people I've spoken to that this is both a blend of political or demands for political change and also demands for economic dignity. But if you just sort of step back from the moment, do you see the economic uncertainty as more than a driving force, but a necessity for political change? And what I mean by that is, if you kind of alleviate the economic pain, whether it's through a potential IMF structure reform, or even if it's sort of like a regional sort of lifeline that we've seen in the past, do you think that is sort of necessary? The pain, not the pain, but let's say the stagnation is a necessity for true political change? Yeah,
I think political change in Lebanon is so difficult to muster because so let's step back for a second. The reason the system in Lebanon, the political structure, which is partly legal and constitutional and partly de facto and sort of customary, right? Customary post-Taif anyway, which is quite a while, is so entrenched because it's a delicate equilibrium of unstable elements. It's like a bunch of chemicals in a bomb factory that are structured in a way that they're not mixing, so they're not going to ignite. Okay, but there is this danger that if one item tipped over and started pouring into another item, it could become combustible, right? And that, from an elite point of view, the whole name of the game has been to divvy up political power, regional authority, and patronage and economic clout and spoils, frankly, in a way that minimally keeps everybody happy, so that in the end, nobody wants to ignite the thing, right? This unstable equilibrium of unstable elements, or relatively stable equilibrium of unstable elements. So, because of that,
that's a book title. That's a book title right there for Lebanon, for modern Lebanon.
Well, okay, someone else is going to have to write it, but they're welcome to it. My point is this: the situation is so ossified and delicate, and there are so many really powerful disincentives that have to do both with people protecting their own narrow political and economic interests and protecting a system that they may, in many cases, genuinely believe is the only way of avoiding a calamity, right? In terms of another conflict or a meltdown or a completely failed state or something like that, that they want it to continue, right? For selfish and for non-selfish reasons, or not entirely selfish reasons, right? Now, how do you get around that? And I think the only answer can really be strong pressure from below, and we have it with the protests. They continue. They're not as dramatic and as powerful as they were, but they haven't ended either. And clearly there's no resolution to the output. The fact that you don't have a fifth of the population on the streets anymore doesn't mean that that fifth of the population thinks things are okay. It doesn't mean that they have withdrawn their no confidence vote. It doesn't mean that they're satisfied or even placated. It means they're exhausted. It means they're doing other things. But it doesn't mean things are okay in terms of the relationship between the power structure and the population. Plainly, they're not. And then, on the other hand, you've got the situation economically and structurally for the country is sort of so bad that there's this outside pressure that can be brought to bear and should, and I hope will be brought to bear, that kind of doubles. So it comes from what amounts to the top down, because, the top being as the international donor class, the power structure, whether it's multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, or key outside funders, the US, Europe, and the Gulf countries, to say to the Lebanese authorities, in this case, the government of Hassan Diab and its Free Patriotic Movement and Hezbollah backers, right? Or the power elite in general, which has had little choice but to give this one color government a chance, right? This largely pro Nasrallah kind of coalition, that creates a situation where there might be enough leverage to make them shift, right? And I think there's a real possibility here that the threat of continued public disorder is so great, and the need for a bailout is so great, that real change has to happen. And it may be modest to begin with, right? But as long as it's structural, you once change. The reason nothing has changed at all is that structural change opens Pandora's box. Once you get some structural change, it becomes like, all right, why can't you do more? And why would you say, right, we'll do this structural change, but not that structural change? And it becomes very obvious what kind of power structure is being challenged. It's much easier to say, look, we can't change anything for fear of the consequences. That's been the position since 1990, in effect. Right? Basically, that's been the position since 1990. And you have these groups, especially the two dominating the current government, which are the anti-change coalition. Hezbollah and its allies, Amal and the others, who don't want any change because they don't want anyone to question and start to undermine the independent military and therefore the independent foreign and defense policy of Hezbollah, and the fact that they have a state within a state, and the sort of very right-wing chauvinistic Maronites in the FPM, who want to maintain all the kind of gerrymandering in the National Pact and in the structure of parliament, et cetera, in favor of parts of their community. And so you've got this anti-change coalition, which comes from those who don't want informal change and those who don't want formal change and don't want any change, the don't touch it constituency. And it's very interesting that the government now represents only the don't touch anything constituency. That's true. My view is that this government has been put forward in order to fail, right? Because I don't think Hezbollah really expects the Diab government to succeed, right? Well, I think their plan is that when it finally does collapse, they will come forward and say, in the spirit of national reconciliation and comedy and harmony, we will reluctantly accept the return of Saad Hariri and go back to the way things were before October, before the protests, or somebody like that, and basically get what they wanted, which is to have a much more broadly based coalition within the elite from which they can then withdraw from the limelight and go back to doing everything they did, which is secure their fundamental interests behind the scenes or trying to pretend that they weren't the dominant power broker. I think what in fact is the problem for them is that, first of all, they're exposed. Right? They're exposed by the fact that the government is now entirely them and their honest allies. Right? And number two, they're exposed by the fact that when they panicked over the strength of the protests, the goons in the street who made it clear that there were people willing to indulge in violence to keep the system going, they were mainly Hezbollah and Amal. In other words, that it became obvious that if push came to shove, they would hurt people and probably kill people to keep change from happening. So they're doubly exposed. And then the other problem is, that's at the bottom rung. They switch back to the top. The problem for them is that if the whole national economy goes down, their fortunes, literally and figuratively, their finances, their holdings, their investments, and their ability to conduct business according to their own interests also collapses. They are not outside of Lebanon. They are not in a bubble floating in space. They are not an island in the South Pacific. They are in Lebanon, and they need the Lebanese economy to be functional and whatnot. So there's a lot of leverage on them in both ways, both in terms of, look, you're busted. The whole line about you're just a resistance movement and you're really basically revolutionary and your guns are only for dealing with the Israelis and all that, that's busted. And when the economy is this bad and the crisis is this bad, you will suffer as much as anybody else. And so I think there's a tremendous pressure on that group that is used to feeling and acting as if they weren't pressured. And in addition, the same thing, of course, applies to all the rest of the elite, all of whom are part of Lebanon, just as much, if not more so, because a lot of them, at least Hezbollah can get some money from the IRGC and from Iran and whatnot, which some people, some other factions lack. And so everyone is implicated. So the pressure on everybody at this point to listen very carefully to what the IMF and the World Bank have to say, take very seriously what David Schenker and the rest of the Americans have to say, and to listen very carefully to what the EU has to say. And, of course, to start to be responsive to the Gulf countries is very, very important. Remittances from the Gulf countries are way down. And I think it's really interesting that Hassan Diab, once he became prime minister, said, I'm going to the Gulf right away. And the thing is, none of the Gulf countries are willing to receive him, except Qatar, which now has to be very careful about maintaining good relations with Iran, because they're very dependent on the Iranians, not just for the natural gas field, but also for overflight rights and also many other subtle things. Plus, it's very likely that the Reaper drones that killed Qasem Soleimani and Al-Muhandas were launched from Al-Udeid, and they need to make it very clear to the Iranians that they were not involved in that, even though it came from their country, but that they were not involved. So they have to be very careful to maintain good relations with Iran. Nobody else will receive this man. So, the pressure is very great. That's my point. The pressure is very great.
You've defined the moment, I think, in terms of that there's a combination of sorts of genuine domestic...
Top down and bottom up. Can I put it that way?
Exactly. Right. Top down and bottom up, and both may be at the same level.
Yeah.
So in other words, 5 months or 4.5, 5 months into these demonstrations. Right. And you said it well. Even if they've gone home, they're still not content.
No. The home, the reduction in the size of these things does not mean everything's okay. And I think the elite knows that.
The other side, which is, I think, the other side of the coin, you're suggesting that there's enough international reluctance to fund the old ways of Lebanon in that field. And I know it's still fairly young. 4.5, 5 months is still kind of the beginning. But
yes,
do you sense that a tipping point has been reached? In other words, where that the regime is inevitably forced to make concessions? No. Okay.
No, I don't think it's inevitable. No, not at all. I think there are a couple of different ways out, right? One of them is if the elite comes back together to preserve their own bacon, and gives the public enough relief from the political pressure and curbs the Ponzi scheme and unleashes sufficient money to the middle class and the lower middle class to satisfy people that something is being done to address their quality of life, and they come together to preserve and make a set of concessions that are limited and tactical, but not strategic. That it's that potentially people between that and being exhausted and lacking a consensus among themselves about what they want and lacking a strong political leadership, all of which is there among the protesters, that could be one way that they try to get out of it. But that would require the elite to come together, which they haven't done, but it is possible. The other thing that could happen on the other side, so that's dealing with the bottom-up part. From the top-down side, if they can get the IMF and the World Bank to accept terms that are strictly economic, and somehow figure out a way to make those economic changes palatable to the country as a whole, because they're going to involve austerity and pain and stuff like that. But it is not impossible. It's just very hard. And can convince the West and the Gulf countries to look at the Lebanese state in a certain way, which I'll describe in a minute. They could also find at least a temporary lifeline in that without making the kind of far-reaching structural changes that I'm talking about, right? They could make a lot of cosmetic changes that don't actually change the nature of the country, or that are just, as I say, tactical rather than structural changes. And here's what I mean. I mean that, for example, if they were willing to kind of pretend to implement some sort of reforms regarding Hezbollah's domination of the state, or and Hezbollah were to kind of withdraw its presence from Syria a bit and ease its role regionally with Iran and emphasize its Lebanese activities rather than its regional activities, and kind of make a show of pretending to implement the dissociation policy that the government adopted about 10 years ago.
The Baabda Declaration, 2012, I believe.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's about 10 years ago, almost. So then that idea that, you Lebanese government and all parts of it, which implies Hezbollah, shouldn't be engaged in any interference in any Arab anything, which would mean Hezbollah should not be there in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Bahrain, wherever the hell it is, in Morocco, wherever they've shown up, oddly enough, in recent years, and basically, be a Lebanese thing rather than a part of an Iranian regional network. They could pretend to do that for a while. And my point is this. Here's the argument that would be used. And it's not an irrational argument. The reason this is possible is that it's by no means an irrational argument. And there's a lot of truth to it. So it's a matter of balance. What could be said to the West and the Gulf is, look, you don't want to fund the Lebanese state because you see how Hezbollah uses it to carry out its agenda. Fine, we get that. But you know what? There is no alternative to Hezbollah other than the Lebanese state. And this is true, by the way. So if you abandon the Lebanese state because you don't like how the influence Hezbollah has in it, you are then ensuring the Lebanese state is wholly dominated by Hezbollah, rather than have any, like the LAF, large parts of which are not dominated by Hezbollah, or other parts of the security service which are not, other parts of the state which are not. And you're just going to ensure that Hezbollah and its allies in the FPM and Amal and whoever else completely dominates the state, and that would be worse. And this is actually true. Okay, so it becomes a very delicate balancing act for the West and the Gulf and others, and even the IMF and the World Bank, if they're interested in this question, for how to support the state in ways that does not unduly reward and buttress Hezbollah, but strengthens the state as a counterweight, the tightrope that the international community needs to walk.
Now, you've actually opened the door to another subject which I really wanted to get into, and that's the question of Lebanon's sovereignty in this wider story. And I attended a panel discussion in New York, and the question surrounded the best route to ensuring a better economic future for Lebanon. And I posited the question of whether or not the issue of Hezbollah and what Hezbollah represents, not that group in particular, but a group like that that can dictate things that a state usually dictates, or for that matter, is a sort of a must before ensuring long-term stability. I got the sense that in the Lebanese context, and maybe you share this view, I'd like to get your opinion, that there's a sincere reluctance to kind of enter that conversation. And I think it's probably a combination of outright fear and maybe that they sense it's a losing battle. And I don't necessarily agree with this position, but that the best way to kind of confront Hezbollah today is to kind of leave it out of the equation and touch on the economics and make sure that their base signing up to that kind of long-term struggle. And I personally think that the opposite is true, that that the geopolitical considerations are still paramount to the story.
Yeah. Can I ask you, when you say, there's just one thing I need to clarify.
Sure.
You say reluctance. Reluctance on whose part to confront that question? On the part of the international community, the donors, or Lebanese?
I think my sense is that from what I saw as well on the streets during these protests and among people that identify with that movement, that they are cautiously leaving the Hezbollah story out of the equation.
All right.
And kind of stepping behind that kullun yani kullun slogan. Yeah. But in other words, the Hezbollah's, what you're describing, the regional security structure of that group, is kind of too big to deal with right now.
Right. So I think, yes, it is the unspoken element, because when you want to address economic and political concerns, if you bring up the question of Hezbollah's autonomous power, you raise a whole bunch of issues that appear to be extraneous to those complaints. And you raise the question of what the nature of the Lebanese state is, what the relationship of Lebanon to the rest of the Middle East is, what the role of Iran and Syria and these outside countries, but that are very close to Lebanon, might be. And you get into a debate that splits the Lebanese working and middle class ideologically. And that's why people don't want to get into it, because all of a sudden you start to lose the leftists You start to lose some of the Islamists. You lose a lot of the Shiites. You lose some of the Greek Orthodox. You lose Arab nationalists. And you can't lose half of Lebanon if you wanted. So that's a problem. However, I think you're right. I think that ultimately, as long as you have a group of political parties and them, propped up by these militias that they've created, and in particular it's Hezbollah, that has this kind of that has usurped this degree and scope and part of state power so thoroughly, you can't have real thoroughgoing reform without it. So, in other words, here's what it comes down to. Right? I talked about the Don't Do Anything coalition that the Diab government has boiled down to its essence, right? And what you're describing is a moment where you start talking about doing something about at least half of the don't do anything part. And then the other half would be, what about democracy? What about uncommunalizing the political structure? What about defanging the national pact and gerrymandering parliament and creating something that's a lot more responsive to people, that empowers votes, that starts treating citizens on a one-person, one-vote basis with equity and not based on their participation in some kind of a big group of a big minority group or a big communal group or something like that. So at that point, again, you've started to alienate people who feel that, well, they have an economic stake in reform and they don't really like the elite and all that, but they like the militia power on the side of their community, or they like the privilege that they get from the way things have been gerrymandered and rigged on that has come to advantage them disproportionately, or something like that. And the formal and informal inequities of the state, right? If I may put it that way, which advantages the least enfranchised and the most enfranchised in different ways at the same time, right? And so at that point, you've really gotten into the fact that the system just doesn't work for people. And I think the only way to get around it is to say, look, listen, we have to deal with these questions, but we have a set of agreements that we can implement, right? Nobody's talking about imposing anything on anybody else. Everybody signed Taif. Let's implement what was agreed on in Taif. The Constitution provides for creating a bicameral parliament. Let's do it. Let's do it not because we want to weaken any constituency. We don't want to take anybody's authority away from them. We don't want to dominate anyone. That's not the point. The point is we want to turn our back on the past, because what the past has meant is two things: civil war and kleptocracy. It means that we shoot each other, or the people who run the show steal everything from the rest of us. And what we need to do is stop at the moment the stealing without going back to the shooting. And the way to do it is to gradually transform the system. The Lebanese people owe nothing to the Iranian revolution. They owe a lot to the Shiite community, right? They owe a lot of respect to the Shiite community. The Shiite community deserves, by virtue of its existence, a great deal of power and influence because it's very big. And it deserves respect of that, but not the government of Iran, not the Quds force, right? The Lebanese people have no business interfering in the Syrian civil war, and the Syrian government has no business interfering in Lebanese affairs either. And the parts of the Maronite community that like the privileges that they've inherited from an ossified system that's based on agreements made in the 40s, rooted in censuses from the 20s, are just going to have to accept that they can't live a reasonable life, either economically or politically, without letting go of it. I mean, I think this is something that has to be gradually, there has to be a gradual process of making that point to people, that everyone has to give things up. I mean, I think you can trace the destabilization of Lebanon to the way in which Lebanon was sucked into the battle between Arab conservatives and nationalists on the one hand, and sort of revolutionary Arab nationalists on the other hand, in the 50s and Naserites, right, versus the kind of traditionalists, and then was sucked into the Israeli-Palestinian thing, and now it's been sucked into the Arab-Iranian thing.
And that's the unfortunate pattern that all generations are familiar with. Right. And I like that you pointed back to the Ba'abda Declaration.
Yes.
And my memory of that moment in Lebanese history, the genuine attempt back then, and which you described, which was sincere in some quarters and insincere in others.
Yes.
But that moment, not that long ago, where Lebanon was faced with a crisis next door in Syria, and one party would eventually become the reason that regime survived. I mean, that they were instrumental in at least.
No, they were key. Without them, it might not have happened.
Is there any room beyond economic assistance and beyond that international component when it comes to money? Is there anything that could happen in terms of political change where you'd see perhaps
yes,
a regional understanding, or for that matter, an international arrangement where Lebanon is at least protected somehow from those battles?
There are two ways. Yes, there are two ways it can happen. One is, again, from the bottom and the top, and preferably it would be both, not necessarily simultaneously, but in some sort of harmony and with some degree of chronological proximity, so that it would actually be reinforcing rather than pointless. From the bottom up, it would be real pressure from all the Lebanese constituencies, including the Shia and Maronite communities, to say that, look, this is not in our interests as a country, as a community, as a people. We understand why you organizationally feel drawn to satisfy the imperatives of the IRGC Quds Force. We understand also why you think it's necessary for you to try to maintain this regime in Damascus in power. It's sort of this, you think this is existential, but you know what? It's not. What's existential is your position in your country and within your community. And this is the kind of thing that can wreck that. And so I think that at a certain point, it becomes very hard to continue those policies if they are widely rejected, including by lots of Shiites in Lebanon and lots of Maronites and lots of others, right?
Yes.
And I think you can see this. I think you can see the elements of that in the protest movement, because the protest movement was not. It did not fail to include lots of Lebanese Shiites, right? There were plenty of them involved. I mean, this is a constituency that was heavily engaged in the protests, right? And they are not suffering less economically, and they are not also less interested in Lebanon's future. They are no way different from the rest of the country, frankly. There is this very strong kind of political domination by a couple of parties, Hezbollah and Amal, etc., but it's hardly universal. It's not entirely hegemonic, and there is a sense that there are other issues. There is the issue of the plutocrats and the Zaim and the bosses and all of that, right? So that even, in other words, even the people who protect you can become exploiter, can be seen, recast very easily as exploiters and thieves, and which they are, all right? And then, and that goes for every single constituency. And then in addition to that, it's like, why are my cousins dying for, Al-Qaim? Really, where is that again? And what's this town in near the Iraqi border? What are you guys talking about, right? I mean, this is not, you told us this was about the Israeli occupation, and now all of a sudden we're in Iraq, right? What is this? And I think it's a bit of a stretch, and that can be. The regional role of Hezbollah is a lot harder to explain when it comes to expeditionary activity outside of the borders of Lebanon than it is when it comes to Shabbat farms or something, as cooked up an excuse as that no doubt is.
So in other
it's
words,
saleable.
So the economics really is the only way forward.
I think domestically it's key, and then I was going to say internationally. So from the top down, yeah, I think the economics is the key to the political, absolutely. And then from the top down, it is definitely possible in the longer run for an understanding between Iran and Arab countries that begins with something where they agree more than they disagree, like maritime security in the Gulf, for example, or some kind of an agreement on Yemen, which the Iranians don't care that much about, to eventually end up in an understanding of what amount to spheres of influence, right? And an understanding that addresses the role and frankly ends the role of these pro-Iranian non-state militias, like the Badr Corps and all these different popular mobilization front units in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis as a state within a state in Yemen, and their integration into the state in Yemen, etc. This is something that if Iran were not pursuing this as a national security agenda and as an instrument of foreign policy, it wouldn't be the raison d'etre of Hezbollah. It's the raison d'etre of Hezbollah because it's the raison d'etre of the IRGC Quds Force and because it's Iran's foreign policy. It's not anything endemic and indigenous to Hezbollah. If the IRGC-QF told them that it would be much better for them to pull their people back into Lebanon and throw themselves into representing the Shiite community in Lebanon and integrate themselves into the Lebanese armed forces on a reasonable basis and end their independent policies and become, part of a functional state, they would do it. I think there's no doubt they would do it.
What you're describing right now seems so ideal and yet impossible to imagine.
No, it's not. It's really not that hard to imagine it.
Can I ask you, just in terms of the ingredients that are necessary for Iran to kind of persuade Hezbollah to focus more on Lebanese affairs than Iran's security?
Yeah, I don't think they have to persuade them. I think they have to tell them. I think Hezbollah would be perfectly happy not to be traipsing around the Middle East doing the IRGC-QF bidding. I mean, I think it's something they're willing to do ideologically and structurally. They probably don't put up much of a fight when they're asked to do it. I think it comes naturally to them. But I don't think it's their idea. And I don't think it's their priority necessarily as an organization. I think it's something they're willing to do. But I think if they were told to do it, they would. Now, why would they ever be told to do it? Well, because ultimately, no, that's a good question, and I want to answer it. Ultimately, there's got to be an understanding and accommodation between Iran and Gulf Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, etc. And it's because they both live there, and neither side wants a war, right? But that's very obvious at this point, and neither side is going away. So they're going to have to come to terms at some point. And for a long time, the Arab side, Saudi and UAE side, didn't want to really engage in direct negotiations with Iran because they thought what it would amount to is having them sign off on Iran's regional gains in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, etc. And it would just basically be that. And they weren't willing to do it. And I think that similarly, Iran right now, there are a lot of people in Iran that don't want to engage in a conversation with. It's now flipped. I think that there are more Iranians who are, wary about the negotiations because they feel very much under the gun because of the Lebanese protests and the Iraqi protests and the protests inside Iran and the way in which things have gone very badly for Iran in northern Syria between Russia and Turkey and Assad, and that they're really losing their grip, and the Israelis, they're really losing their grip on parts of Syria they thought were secured. And the Americans saying they'll leave and not leaving and all this stuff. So, I mean, I really think that right now the bigger obstacles come from the Iranian side because they feel weakened. So basically the problem with negotiations has been that at any given point, both sides feel the other side is unnaturally strong. But they don't feel there's no need for a negotiation. They just want to negotiate under different circumstances. Well, at some point, history suggests, at some point, both sides will feel the need to negotiate is greater than any concern that they are unnaturally, historically, and artificially disadvantaged, right? In other words, that the situation is kind of okay, it's tolerable, that they can negotiate from enough strength, but they have to address their weaknesses in some kind of an agreement, but they do have some bargaining chips, and they're not in free fall, that they will come to an agreement. At some point when that is going to happen, one of the things that eventually is going to get on the table is the role of these pro-Iranian militias that are cancers on Arab countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. Cancers in the sense that they kill the body, right? The body can't function properly, the body of state, because you have these autonomous rogue cells, right? And I think they're literally cancerous. It doesn't mean these parties have to go away. It just means they have to give back to the state some of the aspects of state functions that they've taken over, especially on defense and foreign policy. And once you have an understanding about spheres of influence and terms, you can do that. And so I do think that will eventually happen. And I think the Lebanese, including Hezbollah, would be well advised to try to get their own house in order before it's imposed on them entirely from the outside, because at some point it will be.
I hope that what we're seeing now on the streets in Beirut and throughout Lebanon, I hope that this moment in history translates into that kind of achievement.
Me too.
Where the Lebanese finally are able to see eye to eye and realize that they have within themselves to do two things: to shield Lebanon and to perhaps find a way forward out of this mess that Lebanon is known for too long. I really hope that it works this time around.
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you something. They don't have to go from 0 to 60 in 12 seconds, right? No one expects Hezbollah to disarm and integrate into the Lebanese army in the next year. Okay, that's not what people are asking for, right? What would be enough would be to begin to implement Babda, to begin to implement the disengagement program, to begin to implement those parts of the Constitution, I think it's Article 26 and some of the others, that provide for more democratic means of representation, and for the kleptocracy and the Ponzi scheme and the looting of the national wealth by this transcommunal elite. To be reined in. And if you started doing that, you would start to create a virtuous circle where you would create a very different set of reward expectations and a different set of incentives, right? Of positive incentives for people at the top and the bottom. And that what we have now is all the reward structures are basically stacked in the worst place, right? They're stacked in the system as it has existed post-Civil War and post-Taif, and as sectarian, as antagonistic, and as dysfunctional as possible. And if you started to move between protest pressure and international economic rescue pressure on shifting some of those reward systems and reward structures onto something a lot more positive, you could create a much more virtuous cycle. It's happened before in other countries. Other countries have been in an utter mess. Look at, Argentina and Chile and Brazil, and they've been disasters. And with international support and regional support, they've pulled themselves out of it. A lot of Central America also has been in much worse shape than it is now. Parts of Africa. Okay, so this is not hopeless. You just need to start a virtuous circle rather than a vicious circle. And all we've had since 1975 are vicious circles.
Hussein, I hope the next time we speak, I can gauge your mind on the Palestinian cause.
Anytime.
And last time we met was about 2 decades ago. I know you won't remember this. I was a student, and you were at the American Arab Anti-Discriminatory Committee, the AAAC. Well, this is this is, I think, almost two decades ago.
Yeah.
And
It would have been 2 decades ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next time we speak, we can talk about that issue. And I know
Sure.
that's a different but also overlapping story that we all
talk to you about it because the Palestine issue is one that I don't let go of, and I continue to work on it in spite of the fact that I focus a lot of my efforts now on the Gulf. I still dive into the Lebanese issue because I can't help it, and the Palestinian issue because I think it's really important. So.
And you are also a fellow Ras Beiruti
from Karakol Bish.
There you go. We're neighbors.
We are neighbors in Manara. The ideal thing would be to meet there. So let's do that.
That would be fantastic. Hussein, thank you for your time today.
Excellent. Let's do it again.
Thanks for listening. And a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.